Hello, my name is Karla Diaz, and I'm here at Language Studio, and we have the great pleasure of having Cynthia Herrera here. And hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Karla.
Welcome. I'm glad that you're
you.
here.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to ask you a couple of questions about your amazing self. So thank you for having this conversation with me. Cynthia Herrera, I just know I'm going to say a little bit of background and then you can talk a little bit more if you want. But Cynthia is a photographer and is a teacher and educator. And you've been actually in the second year of your thesis or whatever, almost the final project that you're doing at Cal State Long Beach. You've been enrolled there for 2 years there, which I think it's a 3-year program, but your focus there has been social practice.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you all these questions. I hope we have enough time. But first, maybe just tell me a little bit about just as a photographer, your background, what you had been doing before, and then maybe we can talk about some of the other projects you have been doing, which I can talk about endlessly, but I want to hear your perspective. So just tell me a little bit about, your background as a photographer and what kind of stuff you were doing before, you got to university.
Sure. So my photography work kind of started out as like documentary projects where I first started out documenting homes and houses and how we kind of, as immigrant families, and I come from a Cuban American family, and I live and grew up in Southeast Los Angeles, in Huntington Park and Southgate and that area, and I started by documenting how we kind of recreate spaces to kind of have these reminders of home, taking homes and, adding statues and palm trees and reconfiguring with color and adding, all of these shapes and designs and colors that remind us of home in some way, which was interesting for me because this was my home, not this past that was now making itself into the present. And so I was trying to figure myself out through these photographs, like who I am in some kind of way, culturally and all that stuff. And then from there, I started kind of continuing on that idea of like space and did a whole series of restaurants and did restaurants in Southeast LA and photographing and documenting kind of like the day-to-day activity and just kind of like the reconstruction of spaces within these restaurants and the idea of food as culture and that sort of thing. And kind of the biggest project that was the last thing that I did that was kind of documentary was a trip I did to Cuba. I did a cross-country trip with actually the funny story is I met my cousin for the first time, and it was when she was leaving the country. And so we did this really interesting and super personal and emotional project where we traveled across the country. I met her for the first time. We met in La Habana, and then we drove from there all the way to Santiago de Cuba, and then all the way back. And if you know anything about Cuba, Santiago de Cuba is like where the Virgen de Caridad del Cobre is, and she's kind of like the patron, like Mary, like the Virgin of the island, and it's this pilgrimage that every like Cuban has to do before they go. But what's crazy is I'm the only one in my family to ever have done that. Like going back, like I think I've seen more of that of Cuba than my own mother had at that point because she left when she was so young. But the kind of last straight documentary project I did was documenting again spaces. In every province, I documented kind of like living rooms and kitchens, and the biggest part of the project and the most personal was kind of refrigerators, and kind of like revealing like these personal spaces of like economy and kind of a really telling, especially in Cuba, kind of like a really telling visual of kind of like not only the political dynamics of the country, but also the personal and the transition of time and all that stuff. So that's the last thing I did in terms of documentary photography. And that was pre-grad school.
Yeah.
That was prior to grad school. And then once in grad school, I became really interested not only in doing kind of like spaces, but also like engaging with communities and how and why we reconstruct kind of these imagine like what we imagine our own histories to be like in these new places. And so I started working with youth to do kind of, we started out as documentary photography of local spaces, but then wanted to interject ourselves in this space and the creation of the history of that place now. Like what are we doing now? What is the youth doing now to influence this space, not just the past but the present? And we did a sound booth. We did a sound booth for like a year.
Where was the sound booth, or just explain a little bit where that took place? And
the sound booth was again in Southeast LA, and it was centered around the city of Bell. And growing up kind of in Huntington Park, which is like a mile away from Bell, we started by looking at Bell as kind of this hub of all of these newly immigrant families coming in. We have families who are like there's this huge history. It was a largely white populace in Bell for like 75 years. And then like in the 80s and 90s, there was this influx of families from Nicaragua, El Salvador, Cuba, Lebanon, Palestine. And like in the 80s and 90s, that's when like all of this kind of like transition, change, civil war, all of that was happening in these other countries, but they all come to meet in Bell, which is like 2 square mile radius. It's like tiny.
Yeah.
So we talked about kind of like, this is the histories of our how we got here as a family, but like what are we now that we're like neighbors and sharing and intersecting in these ways? Like how are we negotiating, like being together?
A negotiating space.
Negotiate
right?
again, like always back to space.
engaging.
Like how do you like? And so we got this really cool opportunity to use a trailer for a year. And we reconfigured the trailer, we painted it, we drew on it, we kind of made it our own and made it into kind of this inviting space where people would want to come in, where they could add their own hand to the space. Every person who came in, so what we did is we drove around the city and did different spots where the youth conducted interviews with community members, and as they were there, they were also invited to kind of like draw on the trailer and leave a mark, kind of like again like how we leave our mark in a particular space.
So they were doing murals on the trailer.
We were doing murals on the trailer, drawings on the inside, and then all of these sound recordings, just relating to people's history in Bell, in that particular space,
And how do the students react when they were doing these particular things? Like, did they engage differently? Let's say that from taking photographs to like doing a mural to being in an actual like sound booth of sorts. How did they engage, or did they all engage differently with themselves and the community, or how did that work out?
The first part of it, which was like the collaborative part where we were like making these murals and these drawings, it's like they made their space their own, like this traveling house, because it became our little home, like became theirs, and they had a super sense of like ownership over that little space in terms of like making it inviting to everyone. They were really kind of attached to kind of this one space because they could paint these murals on it and because they drew on it, and they had the freedom to kind of do it. Like the idea of being able to take a brush and leave a mark that they knew would be there in a week or 2 weeks or in a year really made them want to say something very specific, like in terms of whatever they were interested in. some of the kids were interested in like doing something about culture. Some of the kids were interested in doing something about, their own poetry and their own writing, and they, or they wanted to do something like the Wu-Tang Clan, and then they wanted to do, and so they were able to leave the mark of what they were interested in. So that was really like important to them. So once they were able to do that, then they were like, okay, now we're going to invite the community to come in, and then they invited. First to start out with family and friends, and they would play guitar in there for like 5 hours, and then we would take it to the street, and then they were out there, interviewing people or just letting people talk or engaging with people. And some kids were really into, the drawing and the painting and being able to leave their mark somewhere in their own way. And then some of the kids were really into the conversations. Conversations with their own family members, things that they didn't know about, conversations with community members that then later they would come back and say, hey, I saw so-and-so, and we sat there and we talked for 5 hours, and I just met him down the street in the trailer, So like it was such a beautiful thing to see that it sustained at least a relationship in some way, as also, although be it small or that it kind of continued that way. So yeah, in different ways the kids were engaging with it, and depending on what they were interested in. Yeah,
I have, because I know a lot about your work, and the conversations we have, but I'm also really interested in how you just got this amazing opportunity to go to Qatar. And one of the things that I really admire about you is that you're able to pull together so many different things, resources, or things that perhaps maybe going to a different place or working with a different group that perhaps you have no idea, maybe going to a different country, a different city that you don't know exactly, both culturally maybe different, or a different group that you're working with, and then you go, and then you have this work that you're doing, or a result of that, and the one that I'm speaking about recently was the Qatar project that you just went and did, and but you also were commissioned to do these murals and working with you. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe how that can come back a little bit and talk about how that will relate also to your work, maybe, but talk about what the project was, because that would I think would be so interesting for people to hear how that came about.
So I did this project in Doha, Qatar. I was actually from a show that I did with you, from the Fulbright scholarship. I did that in Morocco, and then I have had relationships and established kind of different online projects with students abroad. One of them being Moroccan students, and this time we were in Doha, and we did 10 murals with 60 kids, 30 from LA and 30 kids from Doha. And
Doha, can you explain a little bit what that is?
Yeah, so Doha, Qatar is the city that's really, interestingly, a lot like Los Angeles. It only now with like this influx of like capital and like there's all this kind of industry happening in Doha right now. So it really reminds me of like LA in like the 40s, because now there's all these families from, it's not just Middle Eastern, and it's not just Muslim, which was my experience in Morocco. Like Doha, it's like you have families from the Philippines, families from, South Africa, from Northern Africa, all coming, to this space, and then they're trying to like figure out their place in some way, and there's all this constant construction. So it's like new and ancient, like kind of trying to figure out who they are at the time, and there is like this battle happening like between kind of like the traditional and then all these new families that are part
Immigrants.
that are immigrant families that are part of like the new face of this place, and they need to be allowed a space. They need to be allowed if you're the foundation of a country, like you need to be given some kind of space. So what was really interesting about Doha was that the kids from LA really understood it. They understood like that experience of coming and like appropriating and also intersecting themselves in some way and adjusting, and like this fluctuation of like we'll make it happen and we'll figure it out. And Doha is kind of going through that. So anyway, so we did this project where the kids from LA and the kids from Doha were meeting and having conversations. A lot of the kids from LA were learning Arabic, and especially from Bell. That's an interesting story because we have a lot of Arabic families in Bell, and but still really kind of culturally insulated within Bell. So the idea was that through language there could be a bridge kind of created, between the kids and the youth. And it was funny because even beyond language, like a lot of the kids still, you think you know Arabic, but then you go to an Arabic country and like you don't know. Dialect and that sort of thing. And so what was the best thing, and why art is such an amazing vehicle for this sort of thing, is that in producing and in getting messy and in like, having to negotiate this one canvas between 5 people, that's where they got to know each other. That's where it happened. And so, I'm traditionally a photographer, and we did use photography. So we did this kind of like 10-step project. In the beginning, we would do photography. Then we looked at the colors and textures of the environment that we were in. And all of these things were informing kind of like the visuals of the murals and that sort of thing. And those photographs turned into stencils. Their conversations turned into language and words that were on the canvases. And then finally, they came into this production day where they were using the colors and the shapes and the language and the photographs that they had taken to create kind of like these more these designs on these 10 murals.
And then the kids, essentially, you separate them into groups, and they kind of knew each other based on their skills. I'm assuming what they would do or whatever they had, right, could contribute, and that they would work together to make this one piece, one mural, whatever they were. How many did you make total? Were they like
we made 10 canvases that ended up in one huge mural, but each individual, we called it like a small mural, so that it was like one piece about that group and about their experience together and about what they came up with as a collaborative. What was this experience? And when they finally, this was a like 20-day process, and when they came to the part where they were collaborating and making the murals, they had really built relationships and had kind of understood each other on a different level, not as like separate entities, but as kind of like a team that had come to create something together, which really made that bridge that we were hoping for. And they then in those groups they worked on the murals.
And that's something really important that you're bringing about, because it seems to me that there is this kind of idea of like, some people talk about having an art show or an artwork or a mural or as being representative of, this is the end product, this is the object, this is the goal, you have to show something, but also what I'm hearing a lot to talk about in your work, is also this kind of dialogue or processes that is going on, right? When the aim or the intent behind that is to have these two groups of students, or from maybe different cultures, different notions, so maybe some of them perhaps stereotypes or different language barriers, and then kind of counter that by interfacing through a specific work. We're going to make a mural, that's the end of it. But so can you talk about how important is that through this idea of dialogue or process in the work, that you do? Because I know this name of social practice has been coming up a lot of times, and it's, some people say maybe it's a fancier name, or there's a name that has it now. But how do you experience that versus something else, maybe as just a documentary photographer, let's say, because that was your experience before. I know that people have different takes depending on the background, depending on how they they're different artists have different ways of approaching that or defining that, you know. But I'm just wondering about that because you're also an educator, you know, and I think there's a kind of there's a pedagogical approach to your work a lot of times also because it's an important of who you are and how you work and how you see the work, you know. And is it? I'm just assuming, you know. I don't know, but I just see that a lot, that there's a kind of a way of learning a lot of times, you know, as you're going through this and as you're making the work that you do also, that is part of you, you know. Can you talk a little bit about that, if that makes sense to you, if that's in
I think that is the work. Kind of like the not kind of, but the exchange and the dialogue that happens between anyone who collaborates in that way is the work. And then like these paintings and these photographs become like the ephemera, or the thing that happens to happen because of this. Even in the documentary work, really it was about like researching or looking at or figuring out like some kind of identity or negotiating my own identity, because I think the documentary work was more personal and it does translate into my work with the youth. But I feel like the work is like the idea of like negotiating yourself within spaces and how you identify yourself within that, and then how you identify with other people, and then how we identify ourselves as a collaborative. I think that's the work. Like that's the sustainable thing I see that kind of happens. That's the thing that perpetuates, that keeps being perpetuated, is through that dialogue. And in terms of like how we go about that is really starting from that point and knowing that the you know, if artwork is culture, right? If art is culture, right? That's kind of like the most simplistic like a way to say that. Then we need to know what culture is happening right now, right? And the way to do that is to insert ourselves into these spaces of past and present and what mark we have on it now, and then that's culture. Like that's what's happening. If I'm doing this within like an arts context, like why not just stay as an educator, or why not? I feel like that the purpose of these types of projects is to look at how not only is what we're living and doing now producing culture, but I think it's also very empowering to the youth and to myself, you know, to look at ourselves as like producers, like what we're doing, seeing and thinking and making now within, you know, these spaces is culture. And
that's interesting because you are working with different cultures, right? And that's a skill that you're maneuvering to be able to you know, move from your own culture through all of these other spaces of different cultures, right? But you know, some of the youth are from these cultures, so they can they're maneuvering themselves to get to that point, you know. And I often feel like if you're so when you do, let's say you're doing the project or at the end of the project, do you care so much if you're removed so much from the end product? You know, like sometimes the youth are like putting, let's say the 10 paintings they did, or how attached are you to saying, maybe would you say this is part of your project? You say this is my work. Or how do you
mean
feel
the
about
end product,
that?
like the objects, you know, that are made
like
from
we
this
made
thing?
10 paintings. Do we say this is mine? I
No,
made this. I'm just really curious about that, because it's hard. It must be hard to. I know I have a difficulty with that. You know.
I do, and it's interesting that you should ask that, because when, you know, we have an exhibition, like we show these murals, they're like, "Good job," you know, "Good job," and I'm like, "Oh, that's not my work." You know, or the work was in this exchange, and then this is kind of like an example and an object that I think, interestingly, of course, within like gallery context and museum context, oftentimes I run into the idea that there has to be like this object, and depending on the audience or their understanding of these types of projects, like they like there's like a need for this thing. I think within this particular project, it wasn't a goal, but a space where the collaboration could happen, and a space where the kids could feel empowered. I mean, there was this thing that they made with these new colleagues, with these new people, these new kind of like collaborating artists that they met, and they ended up making this object that they were proud of, but still it's within that sense of like empowerment of being in the museum or being in a gallery, and then the exchange that they did and understanding how to collaborate with people who at first they had misconceptions of, and that now after having worked together, they understood each other as partners. So that for me is I don't even see that as my work. I just feel like you're the facilitator. I'm a facilitator. That's the perfect word. I just feel like I have a knack for like creating these spaces for these exchanges to happen, but always in the end to find out something about ourselves, to find out something about each other and how and who we are as a group, and then have that push us forward in some way, or to the side or up or down, but in some way to do so.
And how do you move on to, like, let's say the next project or the next idea, right? I mean, that's like, you know, do you often, like, because I know I do this all the time, or I'm walking or I'm thinking about something, and then I feel like, oh, that would be really great if that would, if this could happen, right? And it's a kind of a possibility to me. Like, I think of it more like possibility. Sometimes I do it in dreams, weird enough, but I'm not talking about me. But anyway,
no, go ahead.
So some artists for that happens. Some artists, like, they take photographs of daily things, and then it inspires them something, right? Or some artists draw, or or they have some artists like they like to spy on people and hear other people's conversations. I should try that. Or they take their dogs for a walk, and they're like find all of these interesting things that they inspires them. I'm just curious about how your processes as an artist, and to be able to say, hey, like, wouldn't it be great, or wouldn't there be that possibility that this could happen, or how about if we did this, and I'm sure going through those you're gonna like eliminate 50 or things that didn't work, right? But so I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
It's funny, like the projects that and I don't know what the word success means exactly, but the projects that like the sound booth project, the You Are Here project, I think started out one way and then ended up completely different, but still there's that seed about interaction, and that's how I get ideas. The best way for me to ever like feel solid or like inspired is like coming here to you guys or collaborating with Tava from Sight Space, who gave us the trailer, or collaborating with Sylvia and other artists who work with language and collaborate like that. For me in particular, and of course, like, from those conversations, then I can look out into the world with this lens that's very kind of like it's super inspiring. I find the most connection where as an artist, where I can connect with like-minded individuals who are talking and doing and speaking about community in some way, that is broader and outside of a very specific context, like museums and galleries and that sort of thing, who do this in the real world. That I understand. That I get.
I really get that.
I understand the real world. Like, not that, museums aren't part of that context, but even like a little, pushing outside of that and bringing, grandmas and families and kids and other people who
are in the community, right?
Who are in the community, who are making art, who are making culture, who are doing it, who are making, Lebanese pupusas. Like, hello. Like, that's so great. You know what I mean? Like,
when would you ever try, or who would think of making something
only
like
in Bell.
We have to go visit Bell.
We have to go visit Bell. So it's in the talking that really, and then going out with my camera and then having a quiet conversation with myself visually with the camera, I think is really helpful.
Do you often do that, like going
Yes.
and going? And
Yeah.
do you pick a location? Because sometimes I'd like to pick like we like to get lost, right, in the city. And as you know, like living here in the city of Los Angeles and Long Beach or the port here, like it's a big
It's huge.
city, right?
Yeah.
It's huge. So there's all of these. A Cuban friend once told me it's like little islands, right? They are like their own worlds, and you can stay in that island for whatever the rest of your life if you want to. So it's so important, and I don't know if you agree but I to me I think it's so important to kind of move and go to the other islands and kind of once in a while get lost and figure out, it just keeps it interesting visually, like just culturally, whatever, just for yourself to learn something different. But as an artist, it seems like that's part of your process, also of thinking about the world, how you're receiving these images, you're taking that in, and you take photographs. You're documenting what seems interesting to you. I'm assuming, for other people, like I said, we collect things. I for some reason, I'm really drawn to, color. So anything that is like colorful, I like, right? And I collect puppets. I was not on the let's take this out. And I have no idea why, and I love masks and puppets. And not that I know, right? It has to do with performance because my background part of it is in performance, yeah. But so I've always been curious for you what that is, because I know that your parents had also a bakery when you were little, but there was also a social aspect to that, and you obviously had a defining role there. I mean, for a long time, you were part of that space, right? You made things there. I'm sure you were very like social with people there, right? Did you ever think about that? Maybe that's that when you were
like
little?
Being like in like the bakery and how that influenced. Oh my God, yeah. I think like, what's interesting about the bakery, that it's like you're constructing things, you're making things that are you're producing, you're making things that are sugary and fluffy and pink, and like with little plastic dolls. And so I think being in the bakery influenced me in terms of like, gosh, we're a Cuban family in a Mexican neighborhood making pan dulce and and then like eating croquetas at night, and then like just being in that environment where I thought I was also Salvadorian and also Nicaraguan, and also like I didn't really like, there was very little like kind of separation in between that, because my neighborhood was my neighborhood, and so it was what it was. And being in Huntington Park was, every Saturday, like cutting strawberries at 5 o'clock in the morning with my dad, and like being part of that as a producer, like producing something. It was all, gosh, did it turn me into a photographer? I wonder if it did. I wonder if it did, because I think.
But you were exposed at an age. I mean, that's a great answer to say. You were already producing things. It was something that you were observing and making things,
and specific things, specific things, not just but things that were really
something that you were consuming.
And that's very attached to where I was, and very attached to, sustaining me as it was sustaining my family. And so we, making like conchas on like, I think it definitely aesthetically even influenced me, for sure. Oh my God, yeah, for sure. Like I said, having been in a bakery for like most of my life, like in term, like it really influenced me in terms of like learning how to produce the aesthetics of certain things that are beautiful to me, because I understand them through that lens of like that family, and like how that was a center of space where all kinds of families came in. It really the bakery really influenced me, and it was, and of course baked goods, quinceañera cakes are like this really kind of super visual, like part and piece.
Layers.
Layers and layers of things, and how you construct and the idea of what was beautiful and that sort of thing. Yeah, for sure. And learning how to spray paint. And you wouldn't think, oh, I learned how to spray. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's so weird.
The cakes?
Yeah, we spray painted cakes. It's funny that I forgot about that. I was like, how? Because only recently, like, I've been doing a little bit of spray painting with these murals and that sort of thing. And so kind of like investigating that. Not that I'm a graph artist by any stretch of the imagination, but it's always been like a really interesting and beautiful and quick way, like photography, to like get something out.
Yeah.
And so we would spray paint like cream flowers and like quinceañera dresses and like things like that. So I think like all of that in terms of like aesthetics and visuals, and then like the idea of every kind of culture being incorporated on a single object, because we would make cakes for like Lebanese families and Korean families and Samoan families. Ordered cakes that were like 15 tiers with a water fountain. We would like color the water, and then like it would be, you know what I mean? It'd be like super elaborate. So we'd have to like construct these things and like figure out like how to make, you know, this like Mexican bakery help a Samoan family. And it was just, I think that's how that influenced me for sure.
And then also maybe how you're able to maneuver with other cultures and other cities as well. I think that's such a powerful kind of stage or element stage, or that kind of, sometimes when you're young, maybe not necessarily you're conscious of it, but you are learning so much, you know. I feel like a lot of times when you're young, you're like, oh yeah, my uncle taught me that, or my uncle used to do this, or you know, my dad or my mom, you know, they used to do this, and you're like just there in this world, right, having to
without even having to think about that. And I think like, God, being in the bakery, I think whether I don't know if I knew it at the time, but I think it made me into an artist, because after that I'd, you know, like shoot photographs of these things on a little 110 like wind up camera. I'd be like, that's awesome, that flower, you know, or like, you know, weird things in the bakery, or people in the back, or, you know, like everybody like working on things. I would like shoot these photographs of like, you know, cakes for my dad's for my dad to make, like, you know, photo albums of all these like cakes from all over, you know, the Southeast Los Angeles. So it was, I think. Can
you like pinpoint like your one of the, I don't know if it's necessarily a photograph or work that you've made that kind of, you could say, you know, that really, for some way, it doesn't have to be within an art contest, or even that you showed it in a show or something, but something that you took, right? Maybe a photo that you took that you were like, man, like every time I look at this photograph, like it has a very kind of like reaction or a specific thing for me. It's important for me, you know, and that it creates something to me that I'm trying to say, you know, that that it keeps me, you know, like for me, it would be, you know, a photograph of my dad that I've never met, right? It's a personal thing, but also it can be extended to kind of this idea of notion of identity and, you know, family, right? But is there like a project or a photo or an object or something that you made that maybe it's like it sticks out to you as like having coming back to it, and that you feel like, you know what, even if, let's say now that you've advanced, you're like almost finishing your MFA at Cal State Long Beach, it's not like something that you've shown or that people maybe, it's not a matter of reaction or how people have interacted with it, but something that for you, that you feel like this artwork or this piece that I made like really kind of takes me back, or it's important because of this, or you know, for me it's always like, again, it always, like those photographs of old phones always take me back to my grandfather, because we didn't used to have phones, you know, when we were little. So my grandfather and I would be in a booth and we would have a conversation, and it was this kind of relationship that we would have. So to me, whenever I see an old phone, it takes me back to that moment, you know, where I have that, and it always keeps me kind of going back to this idea or notion of like, okay, family is an important aspect of my work, you know, in terms of my personal development as an artist. But how do you, is there something like that for you that maybe, you know, kind of...
You know, I think there are probably 2 photographs that did that for me. One of them was my mom's backyard. Like crazy, like Virgen Guadalupe, palm trees.
I love those palm
I'm serious,
trees, right?
Yeah, like huge palm trees, a big white statue of the Virgen Guadalupe, a big statue of the like Caridad del Cobre, and like avocado, like all kind, you know what I mean, with like power lines in it, and then like
fruit
trees, and there's just, and it was kind of like how my mother is a big influence on me, just kind of like how we try to keep trying to find a home. I think that trying to find home is really big for me. I think it's really personal for whatever kind of reason, for family history, personally, all those things, like trying to find home and how we kind of create that. We like mishmash all these things together, and it may be kind of like what it was, but like not really, you know, and things like that. And I think that photograph of my parents' backyard, and then I took a bunch of like portraits of all my friends in their parents' backyards, and kind of like who are we within this space that was made here now, but that was constructed with a history, an idea of what it used to be like in this new place, and then pictures of us now in this. Who are we in this? That has to be it. Yeah. Like, who am I now in this thing? Is this home? Is this not home? You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's a sense of I mean, I know this for a fact because it happened to me. You know, there's always this kind of feeling of displacement a lot of times.
Absolutely.
Because when it happens a lot of times when you come from an immigrant community or you come to different countries and you have this kind of, a different place. But also, even if I would have grown up here, right, in the United States, I think there's still that sensibility very much rooted in a kind of place of displacement of what home is, you know, and it's always trying to understand what that is, because a lot of times maybe notions of home have been very idealistic, right? Like
exactly
the perfect home, the perfect family, the nuclear family, if you will, right? Like the mom, the dad, you know, and how that looks like. And then how we exist as artists within that framework when we're trying to not only earn or create identities or multiple identities for ourselves, but just like how we grow up. And that it's not so, like, I have to be careful that it's not like my American perspective now, like chiming in a lot of ways when I don't know if that has happened to you, but when I go and work somewhere else, that it's not my American perspective kind of chiming in that culture and saying, delegating and facilitating, right? Where you feel like, wait a minute, that's
me.
That's not me. For instance, I'll give you an example of being able to work with a community of refugees who don't speak English. But I know that culturally, specifically in that culture, there is a kind of denomination of power within the women, you know, that is interesting, right? So if we don't know that, let's say we don't know that this exists in many cultures, like, you know, this specific refugee culture that I'm speaking about, I'm thinking about, how do we, as practitioners of art or engaging people in a lot of different ways, how do we come in and say, hey, you know what, you gotta follow my idea, you gotta do this, or how do you do that, right?
Yeah,
you know, that's a way that I feel. I don't know if you're always kind of aware, or kind of have to sit back a little bit and be like, how do I enter this space? How do I create these alternative spaces to interact, to dialogue, to engage youth, to engage different groups, but that I'm not at the same time, bring in my American ideas or idealistic sense into this work. I don't know if you delegate oftentimes through that, or how do you deal with that?
I think with a lot of work and a lot of time, it's perfect. No, it's never perfect. Never mind. That's impossible. Scratch. It's something I think about all the time, especially since I work with youth. That's a question I get, an obvious question, a question I have to constantly ask myself.
Yeah.
Because my influence is notable. I mean, I'm the one who is in some ways like the center where these people meet. I don't know if we would have met otherwise as a team. So to negotiate that is so hard. It's so hard to facilitate giving, some knowledge about how to create something, or how to facilitate the creation of a mural, or how to make something, or propose questions where they have a conversation where it ends up being something about their exchange, whatever that idea is, and while holding back what I think. Only that's impossible because it's impossible because
you have to say
have to say it's it's really, really difficult. But as much as possible, I think I try to kind of propose or drop what do we think about this? But even giving a question is still
and I bet from the youth, I mean, you must get all of these different answers and perspectives and nailing it down to
nailing it, and that's the idea, is nailing it down, because there's this process we have to go through to kind of and then the process itself, you're you're directing this process. It's hard. It's hard. It's not easy, and it's not perfect.
Well, and I have to give you a lot of credit, because especially here in the city of Los Angeles, you're working with youth in a public school, and you're also working within a system, right? A public school system of education here in Los Angeles that, it's, by all means, it's not perfect, and I'm not, I know we've heard this in a lot of ways, but I'm saying, how do you work within that system with students, having limited resources a lot of times, having perhaps maybe limited support from administrators or from money-wise, to be able to make these projects happen, within that is kind of, I think, pretty amazing that you've been able to do that, because it does really, for once, a lot of people would not necessarily work specifically with a demographic, first of all, that perhaps maybe you're working in, where you're trying to bring together. But do you think those challenges are often overpowering, or how do you manage those challenges? Because that's a hard thing to do with here, the projects that you do.
Well, first, the projects that we do with youth, I try as much as possible to do it outside of the system. I want these projects that we do on after hours or on weekends to be the place where they get to direct themselves. I don't want to direct. I want to throw out I want to propose, if the proposition is for them to kind of think about themselves and how they create something, or how they can create something, or I want it to be that. And so working within the system is interesting because there's still that relationship. I am an educator within that system, and they are youth who have been produced by that system. So number one, having them break from that and having them to make something takes a long process in and of itself. I can't go into a program here guys, here's a bunch of brushes, make it. Like, let's do it. Like, there's just like, all this.
There's a kind of training that you have to get them so that they can understand and empower them, right?
I think the empowerment comes when I help in what it is to use a tool, and then guide them with, like, just keep questioning, well, why about this, and why do you think that, and then they can come to some kind of conclusion. As long as I'm limiting it to why, they can come to some kind of, not even conclusion, but some kind of like perspective. Create a perspective of themselves, about their community, and of their place within that, just to help guide in creating some kind of perspective. So yeah, it's interesting, like, in terms of like breaking away from being in such a innately structured and handed over kind of way within like the educational system, and have them come out of that and to just create something of and for themselves. Yeah, I think is a long process. It's a long process.
Well, Cynthia, I think we're running out of time. But you did it. You've been so great in doing this interview. I really appreciate your perspective and being here at the studio and having me ask you these questions.
Thank you for asking.
Again, this was Cynthia Herrera, and we look forward to your ending project and your MFA show at Cal State Long Beach. And I'm Karla Diaz, and I'm here at Language Studio. Thank you for coming and being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I love you guys.